some real treats for you this afternoon. We're going to be going deeper into the ancient mysteries. So without further ado, I will welcome our first speaker. He has been a notorious researcher, but today he's going to be sharing his research on an area where he's been looking at for a very long time, since the 1990s, since these sites were actually being discovered. He was writing about this even before they were discovered. So I've been working with Andrew and doing tours and conferences with him for the last 10 to 15 years, and I've learned a great deal. So today you're going to get a real download of some remarkable information about the new research and the new discoveries that are coming out of a particular site we all love called Karahan Tepe. So please give a warm welcome to Andrew Collins.
I think just to link what Graham said about Doggerland, I think what's important is that, in my opinion, the same carrier culture of materials that eventually would come down into Anatolia and essentially kickstart Tash Tepe, also, I believe, went through North Europe into places like Estonia and Lithuania. These people called the Siberians, and then from there went down into Doggerland, and from Doggerland, obviously, they went up into the area of Orkney. So, everything is linked. Everything that you hear, Stonehenge, Avebury, Newgrange, everything in the Orkney Islands, that is, in many ways, a legacy of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. So I just wanted to point that out. And of course, from that point onwards of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, coming southwards, eventually through cultures like the Halaf, the Ubaid, the Uruk, you eventually get into Sumeria, and obviously the Mesopotamian civilizations there, and kickstarts them. So everything really begins, certainly in a post-Ice Age civilization type way, with these Tash Tepe sites. That's how important that they are. So now let's get on to my own lecture here. Right. That's the opening one there. That's obviously Karahan Tepe. Now, just a little bit of a background as we ease into what I'm about to say. As Hugh said, I first managed to get out to Göbekli Tepe in 2004. This was a couple of years after my book From the Ashes of Angels was published over there in Turkish, which eventually was banned for legal reasons we can't talk about here, although it will be republished in a slightly altered way eventually. And this allowed me to go to these incredible sites for the first time. And the product of me being Göbekli ended up with a book called The Cygnus Mystery, which came out 2 years later in 2006. And as far as I'm aware, this was the first book, certainly in the ancient mysteries subject, to feature Göbekli Tepe. It also featured Karahan Tepe as well, although to a lesser degree, because there was no excavations done at that time. But one of the important things which I believe that I'd sussed about Göbekli Tepe after going there for the first time was that against the odds of going inside these enclosures and seeing what was before you, is that a lot of people have suggested that obviously they face towards the south, simply because the southeastern depression, as they call that, at Göbekli Tepe, clearly is pointing towards the south. But what I argued right from the word go is that these monuments were clearly facing towards the north, and that there may well be some kind of celestial marker on the horizon that they were associated with. And what I proposed in the Cygnus Mystery, quite clearly because of the name suggests it, is that they were focused towards the setting of the bright star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus, which is a celestial bird. It's otherwise known as the Northern Cross. This is what I put forward in the book. And eventually, as things were going, it became clear that all of the main enclosures, except for A in this southeastern depression, were all orientated exactly the same way towards the setting of Deneb. And they were talking about enclosures B, C, D, and eventually H, which is actually in the northwestern part of the occupational mound, the tepe, as they're known. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues, esteemed colleagues in this subject about this. And, I said, that there's another enclosure been found. It's got a porthole stone with a hole in it, and it points directly towards the setting of Deneb, confirming the earlier work that I did. This time, no ambiguity. And this person, who I can't mention their name, just turned around and said, Andy, all of your Cygnus stuff, he says, is just a distraction. That everything is going on in the southern skies, and basically you need to understand that. I thought, sod it, I'm going to write another book called The Cygnus, something like that. That's how I wrote the book called The Cygnus Key, because I needed to stress this. And the reason I'm telling you this is because of what has come out with the new discoveries. But we'll get on to that. So, as I said, whilst we were in Göbekli Tepe, in fact, it was a site called Haran, this ancient city of the Sabians, on the Haran plain, which you can see a picture of there. I got to hear about another site that had been discovered. This was called Karahan Tepe. I was told it was in the Tek Mountains. And I saw one picture, you'll see it come up eventually, of this T-shaped pillar with a snake on the side of it. And for some reason, my brain just said, I've got to find this place. There's something important about this. And so basically, I went there with my ex-wife, Sue, and a guide and an interpreter and a driver who had been given to us by the mayor of Diyarbakir, which is the administrative state centre, because I was there to lecture on all of this at a cultural festival there. And so we got to Karahan eventually. I mean, basically it was in the middle of nowhere. And this little boy came out of this farmhouse, and, they spoke to him in Turkish, and he just pointed towards this bare hill, which you can see in the back here. And obviously we realised that it was Karahan. It was probably about a quarter of a mile away from there. So we walked up to it, and the closer you got towards it, the more and more stone tools were everywhere. I mean, first few, then more, and then thousands of them everywhere. And I'd seen the same thing at Göbekli Tepe, because now you go in a car to Göbekli Tepe, or a coach or whatever it is, and you don't really get an idea of the surrounding landscape anymore. But I had to walk across fields and meadows and valleys and whatever to get there. And the same thing is there. All these stone tools. Start with just a few, and then thousands of them everywhere. So that's obviously a telltale sign of, obviously, not just one of these sites, but one where there's been a hell of a lot of activity in the past. Now, when we got to Karahan, the first thing that we saw was these angled fragments of portholes, very much similar to like mullions in medieval buildings. I mean, you can see me there looking very curious about what the hell I'm looking at. And there was quite a few of these just scattered about. And I remember thinking at the time, these things are nearly 11,000 years old. They're just lying around on the surface. And the other thing is, obviously, as Hugh's already said, there were standing stones, T-pillars, just poking up out of the ground. So the same as what you've got at Göbekli Tepe, but unexcavated. A few of them did have holes around them, and there were two reasons for this. One, looters, who were trying to dig around them to find out if there was any treasure that they could steal, or the person that actually discovered the site, who was a Turkish archaeologist by the name of Bahattin Çelik. He'd done a few test pits around them to see if they had carvings like those at Göbekli Tepe. So that's why there's these holes around them. And I went back there on a number of occasions thereafter, obviously, as Hugh said, with him since 2014. Obviously, JJ, I think she came out first in 2015. And we've gone back there regularly. And we were there in 2018. And we learned that the University of Istanbul was about to survey the site for potential excavations. This was in 2018. They started in 2019, and this is what it looks like now, basically. I mean, this is one incredibly huge complex, of which, as Hugh said, only 5% has been exposed so far. And you've got a number of key enclosures, some of which represent the oldest rock architecture in the world. This is what we call the Great Ellipse. It's actually designated structure AD. And the highlights here quite clearly are these stone buttresses, which I think are as much as 3 to 4 meters in height, I think originally. And between them, you have these, well, they're benches, but we call them the thrones, basically. And you can imagine elders of the community, shamans or whatever, waiting to do their thing on this absolutely polished, dressed stone floor cut out of the actual hill itself. And, I mean, you know, you just get the ideas of that. Then, obviously, this, which, again, Hugh showed, which is the Pillars Shrine, where you have these 11 pillars, 10 of which are cut out of the bedrock. I mean, that's just extraordinary. I mean, as I said, the oldest rock architecture in the world. I mean, eventually you're going to see rock architecture in places like Ethiopia with the beautiful churches cut out at Lalibela, places in India, of course, where whole temples and, you know, statues and whatever are carved out of the rock. But this is where it begins, at Karahan Tepe. And this is approximately 11,000 years old. As I said, you will see variations in dates, but I'm tending to go by the date of around 11,000 years ago, okay, for anything that we do to do with astronomical alignments or whatever. Some of it might be younger, some of it might be just a few hundred years older, but that's a good marker until we know exactly what's going on as far as carbon-14 dating, which, by the way, when we were there in September, we had quite a shock, because they have actually dated some seeds of a form of wild wheat that were uncovered during excavations at one of the in one of the enclosures, in one of the trenches, and they go back to 11,000 BC, so that's 13,000 years. That's before even the Younger Dryas event. But that's not when they started building stone monuments there. That was probably around 9,400 BC or slightly later. So anyway, this is the Pillars Shrine, structure AB, and the big feature, of course, in here is this head. I mean, it's 3 times the size of a normal human head. It sticks out of the side of the hill, and it's on a long neck. And that long neck has got lines on it that's quite clearly indicative of reptilian stroke serpentine origin, okay? And the weird thing is that you can see it's got this open mouth. And when you're sitting opposite it, which I've done on a few occasions, it's like it's talking to you. It's like it's trying to say something to you. And quite clearly, you know, if you're in a sort of altered state of consciousness, you know, perhaps taking hallucinogens or something, it's going to be, you know, just talking to you all the time. Clearly, that's the function of it. It's clearly oracular in the sense that it's conveying information, but from whom or from what? Well, in my opinion, it represents what we'd refer to as a snake genius. A snake genius means a snake with the head of a human. Why has it got a human head? Because many ancient cultures believed that for the animals to be able to communicate with us, they had to transform themselves into human form. Certainly, at least their heads, so that they could communicate with us on a one-to-one basis. And I think that that's what you see at Karahan, certainly with the giant stone head. So, you know, this is the idea that moves forward, that snakes, I mean, you think even of the snake in the Garden of Eden. I mean, that originally had arms and legs, until it revealed, obviously, to Eve and then Adam, you know, that they were naked and, you know, they lose their innocence and all the rest of it. And then afterwards, God says, right, I'm cutting off your arms and legs now, you know, and you could forever slither along the ground. So quite clearly, even in this story, it was believed that the serpent of Eden had to be at least partly anthropomorphic to talk to Adam and Eve. And that's a story which I won't be going into today, but I am going into in massive detail in a new book that's coming out next year. And this is the first pillar I mentioned. This was the one that I saw just in this tiny little booklet which was given to me. It was second hand, well, given to me, I had to buy it, but from one of these kids that were flogging it at Haran. And you can see here this very strange bull-headed snake that's just crawling up the side of this pillar. And as I say, it was just something that struck me at the time, said, this is different. This is different to what's going on at Göbekli. And I don't know why I felt that. Call it intuitive if you like. And that's why I needed to investigate Karahan. So it seems very clear from the fact that snakes, I'll be showing you more in a moment, that are all over the carved art at Karahan, that the snake as a symbol was incredibly important to them. And the question is, why? What was going on? Okay. Well, the clue really comes from something that came out when I was in Turkey in March this year with a tour group, Megalithomania Tour group. And basically when we go to these sites, obviously we rav it on like I'm doing now. And eventually when we've said our piece, if there's time, hopefully, we'll then say to the audience, the tour guests, what do you think about these sites? What's your opinion? We don't know it all. All this stuff is just being uncovered now. What do you think? And among the suggestions, one of the ladies said, maybe the pillar shrine represents a sperm, a human sperm, and the tail's coming out of it with this groove out the back. And I thought about it for a second, and I said, well, no, that can't be right, because obviously they didn't have microscopes back in those days, okay? But then I thought, wait a minute, actually, she might be onto something here, but not as a sperm, but as a snake. What if that's a snake head? And what if that curved line at the back is symbolic of the body of the snake? So I thought I would overlay it, and I have to thank Mr. Graham Phillips and Debbie and Ivan, who helped me doing this whilst I was staying with them a few months back. And basically what I realised is that one of the most common snakes in the region, the Tek Mountains, is the the Anatolian meadow viper. Highly poisonous, it's still there today, so we must assume that it was there in the past. And indeed, we found out in September that they have been finding the bones of snakes at Karahan Tepe. The unfortunate thing is they cannot tell at this time whether they are contemporary with the construction of the site. They could be much later. Snakes burrowed obviously underground. But they found this particular snake, the bones of it, there. So that's been confirmed. So I thought, I wonder what happens if I overlay the head of this viper on the pillar shrine, and that's the result. Basically, it's almost an exact match. But what this also highlights is the fact that that curve, which some people believe was used to pour liquid of some description into the pillar shrine, is actually, in many ways, highlighting the presence of the actual body of the snake, which I've highlighted between these red lines. That's the actual body. In other words, the actual bedrock's been left and they've carved around it to highlight the position of the body of the snake. Okay? Now, next to this pillar shrine is the pit shrine, which is structure AA. And I wondered if there might be something similar going on here. And somebody did suggest this to me at one point, that, maybe you're not dealing with one, maybe both of these shrines, represent the head of a snake. So with that, I remembered that in this chamber, on the wall of the bench, which is highlighted here, you can't see it very well, but just bear in mind it is there, is a very long snake. It's slightly curving and the head faces upwards. Now, again, please excuse me if this doesn't come out too well, but you can see that the head on the right curving upwards there. And I thought, well, obviously that was important shape to these builders. So maybe, just maybe, they used that shape over the shape of the actual shrine to create it. And that's it. That's the line that I created based on it. and it's almost identical. And once again, I think that this was intentional. Just as the pillar shrine, I think, represented the head of a snake, I think that the pit shrine also symbolises a snake as well. And this clearly was something that was incredibly important to them. They saw these shrines as the heads and mouths of snakes. Okay? Now, why would you want to do that? Well, the first thing we can say is that very often caves are associated with snakes, because snakes are symbols of the underworld. And Debbie earlier talked about there's two zones that are beyond the here and now, the sky world and the underworld. And both of them would have been very important to these peoples. The middle world, the Middle Earth, if you like, is the physical world in which you live. Here we have a snake's head entrance to a cave in Bhopal in India, for instance. So is it possible then that when you go into a cave, if you like, whether it be natural or created, the actual stalagmites and stalactites represent symbolically the teeth of the snakes? Okay, is that what the pillars inside the pillar shrine actually represent? Are they the teeth of the snake? Okay, but again, we ask the question, why would you want to go into the mouth of a snake? And the answer to that is that, and I have to credit Debbie here for actually suggesting this to me when all this was coming out, is that to be consumed by the snake is to become at one with the snake. In other words, if you are eaten by the snake, you become at one with its entire body and thus its consciousness. And if that's the case, are they trying to connect with some kind of primordial deity in the form of a snake that maybe represents everything from wisdom to knowledge to creation to fertility to whatever else? So, if you then go back to the actual snake head coming out of the wall, is that part of it? Once you become at one with the snake, are you then in a position to communicate with its active spirit? Okay? But of course, what is this otherworldly snake? I mean, can we go on to identify it? Well, as Hugh mentioned earlier and showed the wonderful footage and the stills, there is an alignment through the porthole stone. By the way, these porthole stones are what we call soul holes, in German Seelenlock, which means that they are there to allow the spirit, whether it be of a dead person or that of a shaman, to exit from the place of ceremony or ritual, whatever it is, into an otherworldly environment. Usually they're circular. They are there in either the north-northwest or north-northeastern sections of many of the enclosures that have been uncovered at Göbekli, and now, as we'll see shortly, at Karahan as well. But with the porthole stone at Karahan that we're talking about here, you actually have to crawl through it from the big ellipse into the pillar shrine. That is part of a experiential process, a ritual process, I think, of becoming at one with this snake. But as you saw, there's this alignment to midwinter. We're using the date 9000 BC that shines that light onto that giant head. And there is evidence that there was a roof on this structure. I mean, there are like horizontal areas on the east and western side, which clearly probably did hold planks of some kind and probably supported a roof, which means that this stunning alignment would have been even more impressive, very much similar to what was going on at Newgrange and still does to this day. The midwinter sun entering down through the long corridor into the central chamber and lighting up certain symbols. Something similar was clearly going on at Karahan in 9000 BC. So, as Hugh also mentioned, one of the reasons why he and JJ were out there in December 2021 is that 2 to 3 months earlier, I discovered a midsummer sunset alignment in connection with the pit shrine, which is aligned approximately 302 degrees azimuth. And I remember at the time, even before I checked anything out, that I thought, something tells me that this is going to match the midsummer sunset, because I could just recognize roughly where it was pointing. And sure enough, this is exactly what it was. At the exact azimuth, 302 degrees, the sun would set in 9000 BC as seen from Karahan Tepe. So this was a midsummer sunset alignment. So we have two. You've got the midwinter one in the morning and the midsummer one in the evening as the sun sets. Now, this was impressive enough. Again, perhaps constituting arguably the oldest solar aligned structure in the world. But there's more, because just 2 hours later, when it gets dark, this is what you would have seen at exactly the same azimuth. You'd have seen the Milky Way beginning to become absolutely vertical at that exact spot. So in other words, as soon as it got dark, if you looked at the same spot where the sun had just set, obviously at sunset, you would get the Milky Way rising vertically, and not just at any spot, but in the very area of Sagittarius, Scorpius, which is just below the horizon. The sun would have been in Scorpius at that moment, and a constellation called Ophiuchus, which represents the serpent charmer, snake charmer, the serpent handler. It's a constellation. And JJ earlier showed you the gates, the Golden Gate and the Silver Gate. Well, this is the Golden Gate. So, this is a very, very important point. It's known as the southern termination of the Milky Way's dark rift. The dark rift is an area of darkness that goes along the galactic center of the galactic plane, from the area of Sagittarius, Scorpius, and Ophiuchus, all the way to the star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus. And this Deneb marks the northern opening of that dark rift. That's why these stars and this area of the sky is so important, because it represented the point of contact with the Milky Way and being able to connect with the sky world and the souls coming into incarnation and going out of excarnation. And I tried to work out from this what this serpent, this cosmic serpent, might have actually been, or this primeval serpent, and I concluded that it was the Milky Way itself. The whole thing was seen as a serpent. All the way around the world, there are ancient cultures that see the Milky Way as a serpent, and they see it as existing beyond the known oceans. It surrounds the oceans. It's there in Norse myth, it's there in Middle Eastern myth, it's there in Native American myth, in Mexican myth, and in other parts of the world, in India, in Vedic tradition. All of them recognize the Milky Way as a serpent. But if that's the case, where's the head? The head is the galactic bulge. This is the area where the alignment from the pit shrine at Karahan Tepe is looking exactly towards. It's looking at the galactic bulge. And the galactic bulge would have been seen as the head of that serpent in the past. Here's a reconstruction I've done as an illustration. And that's the point that they would have been interested in, because that's the point of communication. They saw the soul as represented by the head, generally by a human head, but quite clearly, if it's a great snake in the sky, it's obviously the snake head, and that corresponded with galactic center. Now, they wouldn't have known that it was galactic center, probably, but what they would have known is that the galactic bulge, which we hardly are able to see today, would have been much brighter at that time. This is a scientific fact, and I've got references to this, that it would have been much, much brighter in the past. And of course, this is what the Milky Way looks now, and that bright area right in the center is the galactic bulge. And this would have represented, or certainly the area of it anyway, this is what represented the head of that serpent, okay? And I think that that's what they were interested in. That's what they were interested in trying to communicate with. This is an illustration that Russell Hussain has done for my new book on Karahan, which is coming out next year. Because what I think was going on here, amongst many other things, I'm sure, is deep communication with a consciousness that was seen to be associated with the Milky Way, and in particular, the Milky Way serpent's head, as in the galactic bulge. And that they inadvertently, in many ways, were connecting with galactic centre, the centre of our own galaxy. Again, as I said, I don't necessarily believe that they knew that that was the centre of the galaxy, but what I do believe that they would have known is that the rhythmic cycles of life on Earth are governed by cosmic cycles which themselves have their origin with the galaxy itself and the way that the solar system moves around galactic centre on a very, very long cycle, and that many other cycles coming down from that, down through climate cycles like the Milankovitch cycle, which is 112,000 years, and then other cycles that are all fractional versions of that, I think that they would have become aware of. Again, almost certainly it was intuitive, but that this is what they were in tune with. That's why they were aligning these sites to midwinter and summer solstice and the winter solstice to synchronize their world with these galactic cycles or the cosmic cycles, and that this is something which eventually would be handed down through the ages until eventually these ideas would be picked up by the Orphite schools, the Gnostics, Mithraists and various others who would incorporate a lot of these ideas into their own religious doctrines. Again, something I go into in great detail, but the other way to look at what was going on here is at Delphi in Greece, you had what was known as the Pythia, which was like a priestess who would sit on this tripod inside the temple of Apollo, and gases would come up from this monster that had supposedly been killed by Apollo, this great serpent monster called the Python, and this would put them into an altered state, and they would communicate with Apollo in the form of a serpent who would be able to give them oracular messages that could be delivered that would decide the fate of whole nations or even the gods. And I think that something similar was going on at Karahan Tepe. Again, not the only thing, as you'll see, but certainly one of the primary things that was going on. And I do believe, as I think most of my colleagues believe, that this was primarily a female-led cult. I'm not saying that the males didn't have their own role, but I think that just like at the oracle at Delphi, it was female shamans that had the main role in this. Okay, right, now on to the newer discoveries. And I mean, as what happens with all of our tours, I mean, something always happens during them. Either we discover something or the archaeologists have just uncovered something as we get there, and we're almost the first people to see it. And this is one of the sort of valued things of coming along on these tours. They're not just, holidays where you sit on the beach all day. I mean, these are voyages of discovery, not just for the tour guests, but us as well, basically. And incredible things happen, as you'll see here. Because we visited Karahan Tepe on September the 10th this year, and myself and Hugh lingered back whilst the rest of the tour group went off over the top of the hill with the local guide, an archaeological student, and also that young boy that I encountered in 2004 who just pointed. He is now a man who is basically the guardian of that site. His name is Ismail Khan, great guy. We see him when we're over there. Anyway, the tour group went off, and it just left Hugh and I, taking pictures and pointing and whatever. And here he is doing that at this very moment, basically. So we were on our own. We'd lost the tour group at this point. So eventually we climb up the hill just beyond the southern edge of the current excavations, which are here. You can see that. We walk round the edge, and we walk up. Oh, and I'm not going to try and use this, but around the left side of it, and you go up there, up onto the top of the hill. And we got up there, and there's a guard there, right, in full military uniform, and he's got a rifle up against him like this. And the first thing he says to us is, "No photos, no photo, no photo, no photo." We think, all right, mate, okay, no photos. We actually put our arms up. Okay, like this in defeat, And so we realised that immediately behind him was a brand new enclosure that had been uncovered. Only within the past, certainly in the state that you could see it within the past few weeks. And we looked at it, and obviously we were trying to immediately take in a whole load of new information. By the way, we kept to where we didn't take any photographs. You afterwards actually tried to draw what we'd seen so we wouldn't forget it. But photographs have appeared now, and so I can show you some of them. And this is what we could see with this guy standing, in front of us, stopping us from taking photographs. And you can see, obviously, it's a new enclosure. You can see a porthole stone in the middle that's round. Two great pillars, which are about 2 meters tall. And they've clearly been broken off at the tops because they've been exposed through erosion, because it would have been right at the edge. And what's weird is that this has been exposed right beneath a path that they created. You can see it here on the bottom right, from the bottom of the hill up to the top of the hill. So we'd actually been walking over the top of this. All visitors were walking over the top of this, not knowing what that was just below their feet. You might have been able to even see the actual tops of the T-pillars, as you can see there. And you obviously can see this retaining wall, perimeter wall, and that's about all we could see at that moment, although we were able to see on a later visit that there were 2 huge, great T-pillars, broken, fractured, actually on the ground, that are actually 4.8 meters in height, or in length, as they're on the floor, which is around 16 feet. So very big, but not the biggest. I mean, the unfinished one on the other side of the hill is 18 feet. The biggest ones at Göbekli in enclosure D are 18.5 feet, 5.5 meters in height. But this was it. Now, I mean, this is essentially what we could see, but you can see there's a yellow bucket there, okay? That becomes important. And you can see a white sheet or tarpaulin covering something there, okay? That becomes important. And that ladder, I bought that for the farm many years ago, whilst Hugh and I were investigating the Hypogeum caves on the other hill, which is opposite, which is up there, called Karahan Tepe today. And so they used, and I gave this aluminium ladder, which I'd bought in Shanlurfa, to the farm. Said, look, you might as well have it. I can't take it back to the UK. And it's now used in the excavations, and it's immortalised in this picture here now. So anyway, but we were told that something incredible had been discovered in this enclosure, which they were petrified was going to get out, before they officially announced it, that is. And we were told actually a few things had been discovered. And we thought, well, what? Yeah, what is it? I mean, we assumed obviously it was going to be some kind of statue or something, but what is it that's going to, in the words of somebody we talked to, it's going to change everything. And it's going to basically mean that in the future, Karahan Tepe is far more important than Göbekli Tepe. You think, what the hell? So, of course, we obviously put the feelers out immediately, to try to speak to contacts. And very late that same night, because we were just full of this, what the hell is going on? I found out what it was. And we were in the hotel, it was the Hilton Garden in Shanlurfa, and I actually quickly messaged Hugh and Jay. I said, get here now. I said, I know what they've discovered. And they both came to the room. I said, they found a huge statue. It's about 7.5 feet tall. It's got swept back hair, beaming eyes, and various other things, and it's the oldest representation of a life-size human form in the world. It's going to change everything. I mean, it's going to be in every paper, every magazine of the world. And with it, as I'll show you, they found a standing vulture. And my brain's already going with this. Vultures, I've been writing about vulture shamans and vultures and the importance of the Neolithic since From the Ashes of Angels in 1996. So, we need to know more. Can we get pictures? Can we find out more? And unfortunately, despite our inquiries, we couldn't find anything else at this time. Although we did go back to Karahan a couple of weeks later after the tour group, and again, I won't say who, but somebody there did actually say that we were looking at the head, and they said the archaeologists found another head. That's what they actually said. They said, well, could we see it? No. Could we see a photograph? No. So, but it were released in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So I thought, all right, well, that's not long. Let's just wait. So obviously we got back from Turkey, and sure enough, 2 to 3 weeks later, huge announcement, basically. And this was it. This was the first newspaper that broke it, which is the Hurriyet News, which is a well-known and very important news agency in Turkey. And you can quite obviously see the statue there. It's, as I said, it's 7.5 feet tall. I'll describe it in a minute. Obviously, it's a guy holding his private parts here in a manner which has been seen before. In fact, the first ever statue found at Göbekli Tepe was a smaller statue of a guy holding his willy, as we say colloquially over here. And obviously, you can see the vulture there. And of course, I'm trying to find out as much as I can about this, because clearly this has been found here. Also, the other important thing we suddenly then found out is that it's seated. So despite the fact it being 7.5 feet, it's also seated. So if it stood up, it would be probably 8 or 9 feet tall. This is a giant, an actual giant. So obviously there's some of the statements. I think I've already said them. 12 ribs on each side, which is anatomically correct. It's got a long beard, long pointy beard. It's got a haircut which looks a bit mullet-like, in all honesty, but I think it's meant to be long down the back, like is portrayed in the TV series Vikings. Where they've got the shaved sides and then the haircut going back, in a ponytail or whatever it is. It seems to be that. And there are another couple of statues that have been found at these sites that do suggest the same type of hairstyle. As I say, it's arguably the oldest naturalistic representation of a human form in the world. Okay, a wonder of prehistoric art. Here's a side view of it. Look at the shape of it. Clearly this guy's got jaws, really big jaws, but clearly the head is huge in proportion to the actual body itself. And you can see the mullet style haircut here. And you can also see the bench in which it's on there. And this is it, as I presume it was actually discovered, because what had happened is that when this enclosure, let's presume, had been decommissioned, they'd broken it. Now, whether this was an accidental thing or on purpose, probably was on purpose. They laid it down carefully on the ground next to where the actual vulture was, which is only by its side anyway. And this is the way that they discovered it. Oh, by the way, there's a story to do with his willy. Is that when it was found, they couldn't, it wasn't there, but they searched around and eventually did find it and stuck it back on, basically. So, because in the Turkish press, the whole story started forming that they deliberately chopped it off because it was anti-Islamic. Serious. But that's not the story. The story is that some of the early pictures show it without it because they hadn't found it at that time. But now, he's been restored to manhood, as it were. So anyway, now the reports at the moment, I'm still watching every day the reports that are coming out. Everything, whenever Karahan Tepe is mentioned, I get a news feed that tells me. And at the moment, they're calling this an important ancestor. That's what it represents. Now, whether it does or not, we'll come back to later on. But that's what the official statement at the moment is. It's an important ancestor. And one assumes that it's coming from Nesmi Carroll, who's the lead archaeologist at the site, who's a pretty open guy, by the way. He does speak some English. He was on Ancient Apocalypse, the TV show, the Netflix show with Graham Hancock. So that's that. Now, here's the little vulture. No, it's the honest answer. So he's not... Right. Okay, here is the vulture. Okay, this is where he is. You can see where the statue is. You can see where the twin pillars are. You can obviously see, by the way, it's a polished floor, obviously cut out of the limestone bedrock, and you know, obviously dressed in this way. And that is the vulture. Now, the vulture almost looks like a caricature, doesn't it? It looks like something out of a Disney film or something. But you know, they are 100% certain that this is a vulture, simply because so many other vulture statues and vulture reliefs have been found at many other Neolithic sites. So, you know, let's take it as that. And it was found standing up. By the way, I've just been told that it's just been removed in the last couple of days and will be on show in Llanllwrfa Museum, which reopens in February, by the way. It's been closed since floods in March. So anyway, that's it. But my head was spinning when I found out about this vulture, and particularly the position in exactly the same orientation as the actual new enclosure itself. Which, by the way, they've not released what it's called yet. They don't know whether it's BA, BB, or whatever. But you know, so I double checked in the last day to try and find out if it had been designated a name yet, but it hasn't. Why have I got this gruesome image on the screen? Because we have to understand why the vulture was so important to these people. Because it was integrally related to the process of excarnation, the soul leaving the body and going into the next world. Just in the same way that the pillar shrine was the head and mouth of a snake, and therefore anybody going into it could be symbolically seen as being swallowed and becoming a part of the snake. It's the same with the vultures. Vultures would come down, pick clean the bodies of those that were left out, either on hills or on towers. You'll see one in a minute. And all of the meat would be taken, and the bones would eventually be picked up and put in a secondary burial, like possibly in a box or buried beneath your house or something like that. And therefore, the vulture became the symbol of a psychopomp. Debbie's already used this term. It basically means the soul accompanier, or the carrier of the soul from this world to the next, or indeed from the other world back to this world. And this is a part of a fresco that came from Çatalhöyük in southern central Turkey, that was copied by James Mellart, the British archaeologist, in the early 1960s during his excavations there. And this dates from around 7,000 to 5,500 BC, so this dates from some time during that period. And you've got two things. I think this is an instructional fresco or relief, because what it's showing on the right, you've got vultures attacking a human body that has no head. I think this is the process of a sky burial, as it's called, taking place. By the way, that other picture, that's from sky burials taking place to this day on the Tibetan plateau. They're still taking place to this day. I mean, if you just put sky burial, Tibet, you're going to get some very gruesome pictures coming out. And this is not the worst, I tell you. But that's still going on. It's been going on probably since Paleolithic times. And it certainly would seem to have been going on in the Taj Tepe sites. Even Klaus Schmidt, the discoverer of Göbekli Tepe, said this himself. He felt that excarnation and sky burials were taking place at Göbekli Tepe. And so you've got, I think, a tower, what they call an excarnation tower on the right, and the body being pecked clean. But what's going on the left tower? Well, the left tower doesn't have a body. It has a head. Obviously a very abstract, naive head. And that, I believe, represents the human soul. And in Neolithic, within Anatolia, the soul was represented either by a human head or simply by a circle. This is, I've got academic references for this. And so what's happening, I think, here is that the soul of the individual, represented by his head, which is missing on the right one, is now being taken under the wing of these vultures, who are either real vultures or spirit vultures, and they will then take on that soul into the next world. As I said, I think this is an education, this is an instructional panel to try and explain, what happens to the soul. I think this is really, really important. So, now, in the sky, the constellation of Cygnus, which we already mentioned. In Europe, it's represented by a swan or a goose, and this goes right the way into northern Asia. In India, it's represented by a swan or a goose as well. In North America, similar birds, but also eagles, hawks, and in the Pacific, for instance, it's a bird of paradise. But in the area of the Middle East and the Near East, almost exclusively, Cygnus was a vulture in the past. For instance, in Greek myth, it was one of the three so-called Stymphalian birds in mythology, who are these monstrous vultures. And in Armenian star lore, Cygnus is a constellation to this day called Anjek. And what's so interesting about that, which means vulture, by the way, it is the celestial vulture, but the same word in Armenian for vulture is the same word as angel. Didn't know that when I wrote the book From the Ashes of Angels in the 1990s. That's a really important point. And it's also important to point out that Armenia, in many ways, stretched into what is today eastern Turkey, almost to the area of Şanlıurfa and Göbekli Tepe. In fact, the Armenians claim Göbekli Tepe as their own sacred site. They called it Pultasar. Basically means the centre of it all, essentially. And in Sumerian myth, Cygnus was identified with a bird known as the Imdugud, but it was also known in Akkadian as Anzu, or the Zu bird. And Zu, from what I understand, is actually a species of vulture. So it's actually a term that's used for vulture. Here's a reference I put down here just to show, Imdugud, a mythical giant bird vulture. But it can also be an eagle. I think at later times, what happened was that the vulture went out of favour and was replaced by the more regal eagle, basically. But the Anzu bird was symbolised by this creature that was half feline and obviously half avian, half bird, which you can see here. And as I said, the bird came to be an eagle, but I think originally was a vulture. And in Babylonian astronomy, this particular creature was replaced, that by the way that represents Cygnus, was replaced by a panther griffin that was sacred to the god of the underworld, whose name is Nergal. And this has been identified with Cygnus and two other constellations that are close by called Lacerta and Cephus. And this was a panther griffin. Now, panthers are incredibly important. Panthers, obviously, is the species of leopard. Leopards are simply spotted panthers. And the main feline that you find in carved relief and in 3D relief at Göbekli Tepe, and also now at Karahan, they're actually these leopard skin pelts that seem to be worn by some of the anthropomorphic forms of the T-pillars that are clearly representing humans. You actually see these leopard skins. So leopards were incredibly important to these people. And there's an image there from Carchemish on the borders between Turkey and Syria of who it's believed is Nergal, becoming or extending out of this panther griffin, basically. And once again, although the wings would eventually be seen as an eagle. I think originally they were those of a vulture. So the reason I'm telling you all this is that I'm trying to stress the fact that even from our earliest knowledge of the astronomy of Mesopotamia, that the stars of Cygnus were associated primarily, I think, with a vulture and also a panther. But, you know, that's another thing we don't want to go into too much detail about. But the other interesting thing is that there is a story in Mesopotamian myth of a god by the name of Ninurta, also known as Ningirsu, who fought and defeated the zoo bird or the Anzu, and as well as other demons. But according to one reference I got here, is that this occurred not on the Mesopotamian plain, what is today Iraq, but as you can read here, the mountain in the northeastern reaches of the Sumerian world in the region of present-day Turkey where the Tigris and Euphrates originate. Now that's the area of the Armenian highlands and eastern Turkey. So what it's saying is that the traditions to do with the Imdugud, the Anzu, the zoo bird, all come from the area of eastern Turkey. And that's exactly the point of origin of Tashtepela. The earliest sites are on the Tigris River to the west of Lake Van, between there and Diyarbakir. What happens is they slowly move westwards until suddenly there's this massive acceleration in development, which brings us the T-pillar sites that we know, and you've seen the map of those. So back to the new enclosure. When Hugh and I were there, we looked at it and we tried and work out. I mean, the one thing that the guy would allow us to do was to get something out to try and see if we could get the alignment of this enclosure. And although that was all over the place because, you know, he's telling us not to take photographs and essentially not to come any nearer. But what I realised, and this has certainly been confirmed now, is that it was perfectly aligned to another hilltop that you can see there, a couple of miles away, and it's got a farm on it. And that's in the northeast. So it was easy to work out using Google Earth that is 20 degrees east of north. Okay, so you can see the farm there. You can see where the structure is there. That's been perfectly placed with the coordinates that we got at the time. And so, does this give us any indication of what this enclosure might have been looking at? Well, the answer is yes. It's looking directly at the rising of the star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus as it appears around 9000 BC. And I suspected this almost before I looked, but I thought, oh my God. This is so unambiguous because this is on the northern slope of the summit of the hill. If you look behind you to the south, it rises up still. Now, some of that is going to be soil and rubble, but it still probably means that the south would have been, either not visible or difficult to see. So this is clearly facing towards the northeast. There's no ambiguity, and the fact that it's on the top of the hill means it's the best place to look at the stars. So, that's that. But there's more, because obviously there's the enclosure there. If you expand out what you can see at this time, which is at the time of the midwinter, this is the night of the midwinter. So remember, in the morning, you're going to have that incredible solar alignment hitting the head in the pillar shrine on the lower level of Karahan. You've actually got here the dark rift going up there, right the way to galactic center, and it almost perfectly aligns with the alignment of the great ellipse, meaning that if you sat on those thrones, you would be staring exactly at the rise of galactic center right in front of you on the night of the winter solstice. And that's what Hugh was alluding to. So, you'd have sat on there and you'd have seen, as soon as it got dark, galactic center rising right up in front of you. And then eventually Deneb would rise, and that would be the perfect alignment of that new enclosure which you've just seen. But going back a minute, if you carry on the Milky Way round, you'll see that it comes down roughly around 20 degrees west of south. Now that's diametrically opposed, 180 degrees, to the actual alignment of the enclosure itself. So whether symbolic or not, basically that in new enclosure is aligned perfectly both to the north, northeast, east and the south, southwest with the Milky Way at the moment that Deneb rises into that position. Tell me this is coincidence. So, so there's something deep and profound going on here. And so, the fact that you've got a vulture statue exactly on this alignment facing into the center of the enclosure, it's like that celestial influence of the vulture representing, the soul's movement either to or from the next world being received into that enclosure. I think it's a shame that it's actually been taken away, but I understand why, because it could get nicked eventually. But so in other words, there's perfect symbolic relationship between the alignment of this new enclosure and the imagery that we're finding. I mean, we haven't come on to the statue himself yet, but of what he might represent. And of course, going back to what I said at the beginning of all of this, we found similar alignments towards Deneb, and I say we, and myself and Rodney Hale, back in the mid-2000s. And these aligned also through the same porthole stone. So you've got this whole thing, alignments through porthole stones. Now people, when I announced this, said, oh, this is obviously wrong because, there's a whole load of rock to the north of enclosure D, this example here. Yes, but it's all been put there. The actual enclosure was built on the bare bedrock and there's no indication that there's any kind of rise behind it. All of it's artificial. So when enclosure D would have been constructed, you would certainly have been able to see, in my opinion, the northern horizon. But I can understand why people object to that. But now we come to Karahan, there's no ambiguity at all. So I believe that this also strengthens the view that the Göbekli Tepe enclosures are also aligned towards Cygnus as well. And the other interesting thing is that I've heard word that the new enclosure is being compared almost directly with enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. So the two are being linked. And why? Because of the porthole stone in exactly the same position. So if the one at Karahan is pointing towards Cygnus through the porthole stone, what does it say about that one? If they're comparing it directly, clearly that must be pointing towards Cygnus as well. Now, when I first went to Göbekli Tepe in 2004, most of the stones had not been properly revealed. And one of the stones that came out after I was there, and after my book, The Cygnus Mystery, came out, is Pillar 43, which many people, including myself, believe is the key to the cosmology behind the beliefs, certainly the sky beliefs of the people of Tash Tepelah. And in 2010, the scorpion on it was identified by archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte as Scorpius. Brilliant. I think that's correct. Because the scorpion was identified as Scorpius by the Sumerians, for instance. And the same year, I'm not going to ruin his name, so I'll just say an Armenian professor identified the vulture on there, nothing to do with my work whatsoever, as Cygnus. Why would this Armenian professor say this? Because quite clearly he knew of the Vulture constellation in Armenia. He knew it was Cygnus. So he looked on that and thought, yeah, that's a representation of Cygnus as it would have looked back in about 9600 BC. And if you put these together and overlay them on the sky from that period, the scorpion, over Scorpius, the vulture over the rough position of Cygnus, no other manipulation other than to put it over that. What you find is that the bull over the wing, which I think does represent a soul, a human soul, in the form of a boar or a circle, but it also corresponds precisely to the celestial pole. That's the turning point of the heavens. And in shamanic tradition, no, I haven't shown that, in shamanic tradition, particularly in North Asia, the celestial pole is known as the hole in the sky. It was through this that souls went out from the physical world into the afterlife or the sky world, or would return back in incarnation. In other words, excarnation, they would go out through it, incarnation, back through it. And the thing is, and it's too much detail to go into, but Cygnus, 3 stars from it represented the pole stars due to precession between about 16,000 BC and about 13,500 BC. And the connection between the Milky Way, the celestial pole, and the stars of Cygnus go back to this time, and that this was remembered in the minds of these Neolithic peoples, even though precession now meant that the celestial pole had moved away from Cygnus and was now in an area of the constellation of Hercules where there was no bright star whatsoever. I still think that they retain this connection between Cygnus and the celestial pole being in that area, basically, certainly from a pictorial point of view and a symbolic point of view. But cutting things down to very basics here, what we now seem to have is that the lower level of Karahan Tepe, with all of its serpent imagery, seems to represent the underworld and going into the underworld, whereas I think that the summit will relate to going into the sky world. And I think that we will find more evidence of this as we go along. And the significance about this is that much later, pyramids would be built with exactly the same symbolism. The sky world would be associated with the other part of it, or the platform on the top, with ziggurats, whatever, and underneath them you would have either constructed or natural caves that would represent the underworld. I mean, something like Teotihuacan in Mexico is a prime example, but quite clearly you can grasp this concept that the top of a pyramid represents the sky world, bottom of it represents the underworld. And so in many ways, Karahan is almost like a prototype role model for what would later become the pyramid. Now we go on to Göbekli Tepe. Very quickly, we'll just look at what's been found there. Because around the same time that the release concerning Karahan came out, it was revealed that they'd found this massive 1.3 metre in length wild boar right in front of the porthole stone that's aligned towards Cygnus. And it sits on this plinth, which may have been part of a T-shaped pillar itself, with snakes on it, the H symbol, which JJ was talking about, and apparently there's 3 human heads on it somewhere, but I can't see them, in all honesty. And so, you marvel at this and you think, well, what does that represent? I mean, it's fun to try and find out why you would put a huge, great boar right on the axis and alignment of this particular enclosure, which is enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. And this is just a few ideas we're just playing around with at the moment. I mean, firstly, the god Adonis is killed by a wild boar. And sacrifices of boars would actually take place at midwinter to avenge that boar's actions. And this would ensure that the god reappeared in the spring, obviously, presumably after the midwinter, which is why these sacrifices would take place at midwinter. And obviously, it's a similar stories of boars, or a human in a boar form, or boar in a human form, whatever, in various other traditions, not only to do with Adonis, but Attis, Osiris in Egypt. So I think that this is a part of it. So the boar is associated both with midwinter and a constellation marking this time. As to which constellation, we are still trying to work this out. but we think it must be somewhere in the area of the southern termination of the Milky Way's dark rift. And there are a few candidates, but let's not worry too much about that, because, to be honest, we are just speculating at this time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the news reports that are coming out, even now, are saying that the statue is an important ancestor. So is it the face of one of the so-called Anunnaki, or sky people? In other words, what would become known in Babylonian as the Anunnaki. And the question then is, well, what are the Anunnaki? We hear a lot about them. The Anunnaki is the name that was given to the gods in general in Babylonian times, and it basically means the gods of earth and gods of heaven and earth. But their earlier Sumerian name was Anunnaki, which basically means, or it can mean of a princely line, but it also generally means of the sky god An. But what it can also mean is of the sky people, or the sky people, the people of the sky. And, you know, I think, was it Debbie, you were talking about skywalkers earlier? I think that ultimately the Anunnaki were the skywalkers. They were the original elite, I think, that founded Taj Tepe. And Klaus Schmidt himself, in his book, said that he believed that Göbekli Tepe was the Dooku Mound, which is where the Anunnaki was said to have risen from and given to humans the gift of sheep and grain, which are metaphors clearly for animal husbandry and agriculture. And, right, hold on, let me just flash through here. Right, I think, have we gone on time? How many minutes? Eh? None. All right, okay. Right, okay, well then I'll just flash through this. I mean, basically, you know, who are they? Well, ultimately, we've been, you know, Debbie talked about this, JJ talked about this. All the indications are that we're talking about Siberia, Mongolia, as the point of origin of what would become the Taj Tepe culture. I mean, a journey that probably began as early as 30,000 years ago, something that Turkish archaeologists are accepting now. And this story here says it. This came out in 2022. We'll talk about this. It's just basically what it says is the evidence here. And what they're saying is that these ideas were carried from the Urals into Southwest Asia. And one of the main carrier cultures was the so-called Siberians. And Russell Hussain, a London artist who works with me a lot, created these images of what Siberians would look like based on all information that we had from anatomical remains. And I just find this so similar. The head, I find similarities between the head that was done. This was long before we knew anything about the Siberian stuff. This is when I was working on Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. And that head, I see similarities in the style there. And if that is the case, is it possible that we are looking upon the first true likenesses of one of the founders of Taj Tepe, quite literally an Anunnaki? I think the answer is an overwhelming yes. Thank you.